Our challenge is, how do we draw architecture quickly? Particularly architecture that has some detail in, which is very often why we want to draw it. Yet that complication can make it more challenging even to do a quick sketch, something that would be suitable for, say, urban sketching, sitting in the street and drawing it. I thought this grand gatehouse to Parramatta Park in Sydney was a good example to experiment with a gestural, a quick style of drawing, a fairly animated, lively style, not getting bogged down in exactness, but trying to capture the feel of the architecture. And firstly, we have to work out what that means. What is the feel of the architecture in this case? And I think it's particularly this play between the dark brick and the light plasterwork. So whatever I do, I want the contrast, the jagged, serrated feel that this decoration gives to the building. Now, with any architecture, the important things are the perspective and the proportions. So I need to get these angles correct, and I need to make sure that every horizontal line across the front of the facade increases in angle slightly as it goes up higher from eye level, which is pretty much the eye level of the gentleman walking through the gate. That's not necessarily the case, because the eye level of the person taking the photo is not always lined up with the eye level of people in the scene. But what I need to do particularly is where I have details such as these castellations on the very top, this castle-looking parapet, I need to just grab that as an overall feel. It's often more capturing the shadows and some of the spaces. Now, I worked out before I began this exactly how I was going to do these edges, and you can see what I've done. You're watching this at just over double speed. This took me just under 40 minutes to do in real time. So if you want to watch me draw it in almost real time, use the cog icon to reduce this video to half speed, and that's only very slightly more than my actual drawing speed. And even though the bricks go horizontally, I've done the hatching to represent the colour vertically because, well, for a quick sketch, it was just going to take too long to do it vertically. And I'm not really wanting to represent the bricks at all, because when we glance at this, it really is more a blanket brick terracotta colour that we're seeing. Now, if you look at the bay window, and particularly the underneath sections where it steps back to the wall, you can see that it's a very approximate job I've done because I am trying to capture the feel. Now, I started in this upper corner because I felt that this was the most uncluttered part of the scene that I could use to try and get proportions correct, and then work across and then down. I felt that if I was to work it from ground level up, it was just going to be a little bit complicated to position things as accurately. It was easier to work across that front section with the bay window, and then I could go to the left down the side wall and to the right with this pseudo tower effect. I'm using a 0.2 Copic multi-liner pen. I was going to use a 0.3. At the last minute, I thought it was probably just a little bit too thick. It would make it difficult to do the amount of detail I was going to do at this scale. Now notice how I do the wrought iron in this gate. Again, I'm not trying to be exact, but I do want to capture the feel. And part of that is to do something which is approximately symmetrical and does, in an approximate way, capture the main curves that we see in the ironwork. And it certainly didn't take very long at all. You can see how this way I had of doing the decorative brickwork and plasterwork really became very quick. The one thing I did do was I would count how many indentations there were before I kind of did the little rectangles, if you like. I found that was very helpful in me keeping the scale correctly, not letting them get too small or too large, which would have affected the overall feel of the building, of the decorations. And particularly from left to right, if I'd increased the size or decreased them, then it would have worked against the visual impact of the perspective. Perspective is not just about angles, it's also about scale. Now, I've moved to the left and I'm doing this corner little decorative tower. You'll see that I've really done this cornice that comes out as a rounded shape rather than trying to do the angles. Sometimes I feel that that's more than adequate for a glance, and it's far easier to get looking accurate. If I try and do each of the little hexagonal corners or sides, if I get them out of kilter with their angles, that can draw unhelpful attention. And now I go up, and there is actually this section I'm drawing now. It's in 3 steps. There's like a flare, and that narrows, and then there's 2 slightly getting smaller prisms that sit on top. And now I do this. Now, the one mess up I do on this is that angle there that I've just done. It's not steep enough. I should have paid more attention when I did that, because it would have taken no effort just to drop it more on the left-hand side so that the angle was steeper, and then it would have represented far more accurately the scene. And while it's I don't think noticeably wrong when we look at the finished drawing, I always feel that steeper perspective angles just add a little bit of intensity, a little visual drama to what we see. And so I feel like I've just robbed the view very slightly of some of the visual tension, which often makes a drawing look dynamic. And so now I'm coming down this left-hand side, counting how many of those little boxes to colour in before I come down the side. See, I find that's far more accurate than trying to do an in-out, in-out, in-out outline. Sometimes outlining is the difficult way to do it, and blocking things in a more holistic way can be both accurate and look better at the end. We really want to get away from the idea that drawing buildings is about outlining shapes with lines. Lines can be very useful, but they're not always the easiest or most helpful way to establish the visual effect that we want in our scene. And so now I have the detail at ground level, where we have this darker, probably more solid, harder stone base. And I decide not to get bogged down in doing that too exactly, because the truth is that the eye goes up to all the more decorative elements. So I save a bit of time, because if I were travelling, 40 minutes would be long enough to sit and do the one drawing. If I took longer, I'd probably find whoever I was travelling with had gone off and left me. The perpetual problem for the urban sketcher. And a lot of what I'm doing now, these shallow decorative relief areas, I'm really trying to draw the shadows. The one thing I am trying to make sure I do is to put all the depth line-ins that we can see from this angle. And the depth lines that we see are on the right-hand side of recesses. So I really want to do that, because that creates the sense of 3 dimensions, that the elements in this building come out and go in, come out and go in. And that's very important for a sense of realism. And put that figure in there. When we put figures in a scene such as this, it's really, really important to slow down for a second, even in a fast drawing, and make sure we get the scale correct. It can be helpful, I didn't do it here, but a good system I have is to put a dot for the top of the head and put a dot for where I think the feet are going to be or need to be, and put a dot where I think the waist will be. And that helps me just position correctly proportioned sections of the body through that space. Because if I end up making the figure too small or too large, it throws out the sense of scale of the building, because we tend to see a figure and go, oh, well, we know what figures are, so therefore we'll judge everything else against the size of the adult figure. With that iron fencing, iron railing on the bottom right, it's important to get the foreshortening approximately correct, that the railings move closer together as they move further away from us, but also doubly because the rail is curving away from us as well. So we need to make sure we don't just go down in a straight line, spacing them all equally. Again, this is where observation, to see the things that we need to see. You'll notice what I haven't done is I haven't tried to rough out the entire shape. There's a good reason for that, I think, when I draw freehand in ink, because it's very hard to get those rough outlines correct. And because I like to draw directly in ink, it was part of how I cured myself of perfectionism by eliminating the possibility of endlessly erasing lines that I kept thinking, no, it's not quite right, and making me just commit to what I've done and move on with the drawing. I now lose the possibility of erasing rough outlines that aren't correct. I find it easier to do some often guidelines just to help me, or some dots to help me see where the angles are going to go. But to move out in all directions, space in the various geometric, if you like, elements of the building, and to use what I've already drawn as my reference point, looking at horizontal alignment and vertical alignment and so forth, to keep the scale correct, which means I'm constantly referring back to look at what I've done against what I'm about to do, both in the reference first and then in my drawing. And the other challenge is to keep the same, if you like, looseness in the way I do this decorative serrated edging. Because we're actually going further away, it works quite well to become, if anything, a little bit more loose, a little bit less precise than I have been in those closer sections, that corner that I started with. Still doing the depth lines where I can, and particularly with these bands, these horizontal bands that come out, decorative horizontal banding, to try and do a little bit of a darker, heavier line underneath them, because that also shows how the three-dimensionality is catching the light and casting a shadow, and being in shade and casting a shadow. So that's also important, to create a sense of 3 dimensions, and also to avoid the danger of the object looking flat, looking 2-dimensional. Having our architecture look rounded, look 3-dimensional, is a constant challenge, and it's why it's often good not to get bogged down in trying to do exact lines that meet in precise corners, because it can be hard then to do everything. My other problem I have when you try and rough out large areas such as this with a pen is that if we don't get the larger shapes exactly right in proportions, when we, if you like, subdivide into smaller sections, it can become impossible to put the detail in those smaller sections that we need to put in without having, often from a visual sense, quite ludicrous proportions. Windows that become way too wide or aren't nearly high enough, or the gaps between the windows have to be too wide or not wide enough if we try and draw the windows the same shape, and so forth. So now I've got the context, I've got these trees behind, and in some areas I keep the trees dark where they come up against a light coloured section of the building, and in other parts I keep them light where they come up against a dark section. I want them to feel that they are behind this gatehouse, so that's important. And somehow I slowed that down. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you enjoyed this. Why not have a go drawing? It looks complex, but I hope some of the things I've said have given you some ideas or confidence in not getting bogged down in exactness, but to try and capture the feel of this mock Tudor gatehouse. And you'll find this reference photo, of course, on my channel community page. And if you haven't hit the like button, please do it now for me. So why not give it a go? But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I certainly did with this. I'll see you next time. Bye.